finance really managed if the institutions have to be defined legally by an existing government, but governments get turned over and destroyed and reformed. So I wanted to just mention a couple of examples of wartime effects on finance. First example, World War I. Okay, Germany lost, in case you haven't heard, and in 1918, people had them at their knees. They were conquered, and people were really angry. So we had the reparations that were imposed on Germany. So how do you think, I just want to say, how do you think the reparations went? People thought Germany should pay for the crimes they committed in World War I. How did they do that, though? Well, they could have just said, we confiscate all your stocks and land and holdings, everyone. They didn't do that. They instead demanded reparations from the government. And the government had to figure out how it would finance the reparations through taxes. So they did tax the German people to repay the victors in the war. Actually, it turns out, however, they never did it because the victors in the war saw how hostile the German population was becoming, feeling a great injustice in the reparations. So they canceled them by the 1920s, and they never had to pay. So that means that, if you own stock in a German company in Germany, you go right through the war, you still own it. In World War II, it was even better because they had learned their lesson that you don't go penalizing individuals for the sins of their government. So after World War II, they just left them all alone, except in East Germany. You know what happened in East Germany? Well, the communists took over. And that was different because the communists didn't have a capitalist ideology at all. And their ideology could justify just grabbing things. So that's what they did in East Germany after World War II. Later, after the reunification, people could sometimes reclaim their lost property. And another example is in Iran. There was the Iranian Revolution in 1979 in which the Ayatollah displaced the Shah of Iran. So what do you think these are fundamentalist Muslims. What do you think they did with financial holdings? Well, notably, a lot of the government under the Shah employees were paid pensions. And they were retired now, and they were expecting to live off their pension. So what do you think the new radical Islamic government did? It left it. They let them, it seems fair to them. They left it. So you could keep your pension, even though it looked like you got it under under a bad, to their mind, government. And then another example is South Africa in 1994, in which a white majority government that had oppressed blacks for decades or centuries took over. And what do you think? Do you think they confiscated? What about people who had pensions or insurance? They left it. So why does this happen? So you have turnovers of governments that are very hostile to the one that had defined the financial institutions. So what would your expectation be? The expectation might be that they'll leave it because they want to be reasonable. It's in their interest to be reasonable and understand that we don't just abrogate contracts that were made. On the other hand, it doesn't always work out that way. So socialist theory allowed Vladimir Lenin, Lazar Cardenas, Mao Zedong, Mohammad Mossadegh, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Indira Gandhi, and others to justify major confiscations of property and nullifications of financial arrangements. Notably, after World War II, in Japan, there were the big four zaibatsu called Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Yasuda that were blamed for some of they were powers that behind the government in Japan, and they were blamed for some of the things that by the victors that some of the things that happened in World War II. Now, in this case, it was the United States as a victor. They're not a confiscating country. But what the U.S. did do is force the Zaibatsu to sell their assets and put the money in nominal yen government bonds. And then they just, the Japanese government then had a massive inflation, and it destroyed the real value of those bonds, and they never got anything back. So the Zaibatsu were immensely diminished after World War II. So I think a war is kind of risky it ought to be very risky for financial contracts. But it isn't always the end of them, because underlying it there is a certain civil society that respects individuals and thinks that individuals signed contracts, they acquired property by buying it, by working hard and earning money and buying it. Why would you just abrogate those contracts after a war? So I think when you think about long-term investing, you have to think about these possibilities, that the world is disruptible. And you have to think about the basic ethics of the investment you're making. If it's sound and it's not abusive or odious, then it should be all right. The word odious debt has been used many times to justify confiscating it. When the debt was raised by a government that was using it for ill purposes against the will of the people, that's odious debt. And so ultimately the survival of your investment in government debt depends on whether it's odious or not. So you have to look at the moral underpinnings of the country that's issuing the debt and consider that a major factor, because ultimately it will be civil society that will decide whether you get paid back or not. Another thing that comes to my mind often in considering the morality of finance is the old Malthusian principle about the dismal law of economics and population growth. So, Thomas Malthus wrote one of the most famous essays in the history of economics, called An Essay on the Principle of Population. I assume you've all heard of this, right? It's this is standard, Phil. On the other hand, I think it's emphasized even today. But if you read his essay, the basic point was that population naturally increases, and according to a geometric ratio, whereas subsistence for man increases only in an arithmetical ratio. So the population goes on doubling itself every 25 years. But the resources cannot. So this gives us the dismal law of economics, that any improvement in the ability to give subsistence to man will be met with by population increases. So men and women are historically in near starvation because there's too many of them. And if anything is done to alleviate the situation, it just means there'll be more people in starvation. Malthus had a powerful argument. Unfortunately, it leads to a sort of hopelessness that we can't do anything. And what is finance able to do ultimately? So anyway, the thought I have about this is we shouldn't despair, though. I think Malthus may be right in the really long run, talking centuries. But we're living here and now, and I think that we can do a lot to make the world we live in better off. And ultimately, I don't know about future centuries in the future. I think we have a moral obligation to use our economic principles to make people better off now. Another thought is, I said, was the importance of financial theory. I've talked a lot about behavioral finance in this course, but I want to come back and say that mathematical finance of the traditional kind is still extremely important. And the world will never be the same again because after the development of mathematical finance. There is a theory of the allocation of scarce resources and also of the pooling of information through markets that was not understood by most people in the early 20th century. And that's why I read critics of finance with a certain amount of skepticism, although I am also one of them. I think finance, I find myself admiring the financial system, the efficiency with which it feeds billions of people and provides education and innovations to them. So I think that the basic financial theory is valid. And even people who seem to be doing things that are remote from productive, they look like takers, like people who trade in options, for example. They are not necessarily takers. They're doing something for the system that makes it more efficient. And the benefits are not to society are not easily seen. On the other hand, the critics may have a point about recent trends, that things are not going absolutely optimally. So behavioral finance, which we've talked about in this course, which involves other social sciences like psychology, I think is the salvation of mathematical finance, because it's like adding friction to Newtonian mechanics. Isaac Newton described the motions of the planets, but wasn't able to describe the motions of machines here on Earth, because there were other things like frictions that intervened with his laws of mechanics. So we have to add friction to those models. And similarly, adding psychological principles to mathematical finance is important. There are hardcore mathematical people, I've met them, mathematical finance, that have a tendency to act as if they're threatened by behavioral finance. But I don't think that's the way they should be reacting. I mentioned law schools. When I first got my PhD, I was hardly aware of law schools, it seems. Over the course of my career and trying to read and understand economics and finance, I find myself more and more reading law journals and learning what goes on in law schools. I think this goes back to what Gillian Tett called the silo effect. It's unfortunate that we are separated from, well, we in economics are separated from professional schools. We have a separate management school too, separate law school. I guess it's maybe necessary to have these compartmentalizations, and yet it seems to me that they operate together, better together. So law schools are as necessary as the math finance people. What I like about law schools is that they operate very much in the real world, especially in a common law environment where cases are the basis of law, so that there's individual conflicts among people that have to be resolved. Very real world, very much psychological. You can't well, maybe there is a pure mathematical law, but mostly it's down to earth. And it seems to me that most of the economic principle proposals that are embodied in laws are from law school people who probably read economics. Now I wanted to talk about wealth and poverty because it's coming to a head these days. The concern that people feel about inequality is increasing dramatically. The current election in the United States has on both the right and the left people who seem to, whose prominence seems to stem from some resentment about inequality. There was a recent study, it was just reported in the New York Times yesterday by David Autor at MIT and his colleagues, that looked at polarization by state in politics and compared that with loss of jobs in economics. And they find that the states where a lot of people have lost jobs to globalization or automation tend to also be states where polarization is in politics is the highest. So it's suggesting that what's happening now in politics is not independent of rising inequality. It's predictable. So I think part of the problem here is that we haven't democratized finance. That is, we haven't dealt with the risks that people face. They talk a lot about, for example, in rural areas, there'll be a factory set up, and people buy their homes adjacent to an isolated factory. It was put there because the people there were low wage, and so there was a benefit to hiring there. But now you have a community built around a factory. Then they find that the business finds that it can get an even lower wage in some less developed country. So they shut down the factory and leave. The people who were there, unfortunately, didn't have financial contracts to protect them against that risk. So when the factory shuts down, not only do you lose your job, but you lose your house. Well, because the house isn't worth anything anymore. The people only wanted houses there because there was this factory employment there. I may be giving an exaggerated situation. But people weren't advised about this. You shouldn't buy a house next to this factory because you're staking everything on the success of this factory. They could have just rented. So we could have democratized finance and prevented these things somewhat by just giving a subsidy to financial advisors. It's something that I advocated in my books. The government already subsidized financial advisors by giving a tax break. But if you hire a financial advisor and you pay that person for the advice, you can deduct that payment from your income taxes. However, that only benefits you if you're high income. Most low-income people don't even itemize, so they would never get any break from it. So the government is subsidizing financial advice for wealthy people and not for poor people. But poor people who took that job next to a factory should have been told, very simple, don't buy, rent. That means that you are not taking the risk of putting of your own home value collapsing along with your wage. That would be common sense, but people who don't have advisors are not aware of these risks and don't think about them. Most people don't buy financial advice because it's expensive, and they feel that they can't afford it. There's also a what you see is all there is effect, that Kahneman and Tversky. People tend to assume that they have the evidence. They talk to their neighbors. They think that it's a smart thing to buy a house next to a factory that in otherwise farmland. And they also have these common ideas that home prices always go up, and homes is a great investment. I know that people think that, but it's naive to think that. You have to think like a trained financial advisor to get the prospects for the value of a home. So poverty is substantially due to unmanaged risks. And one of the most important things we can do for inequality is to make the risks better, is to make risk management better. Wealth and monuments. We are standing right now in a monument to Mr. Zhang in China, who was educated here at Yale and donated money to build this auditorium. I have another example it's a little bit I think we have to thank him for doing this. And he actually did this as a young man. Usually, monuments get built at the end of one's life. So this is a more typical example. J.P. Morgan was one of the, or maybe the richest man in America. And he built his house in Manhattan at 36th and Madison Avenue. And he built it between the years 1906 and 1910. There it is. Nice house, right? On prime land, by the way, right in the center of Manhattan. That's the interior, that's the library. Pretty nice. But he only lived there for 3 years. And what is it? It's a museum now. It's for you. You can go visit it. They just did a renovation there. This is what happens, that people accumulate wealth throughout their life, and it ends up being dispersed somehow, one way or another. What do you do with this? After J.P. Morgan dies, what do you do with this house? It just seems logical it should be a museum, and there it is. You can go and visit it. So there is, though, something about allowing people to take risks and make money, and the result is a more lively society at the expense of a more unequal society. So the study that I'm referring to here looked at primitive societies and found that some societies are less focused on deal making and wealth accumulation. Those that are, though, have more inequality and more wealth as well. So it's not just modern capitalism that has this dilemma about deal making spurs wealth, but it also makes it somewhat unequal in distribution. This unequal distribution of wealth is probably less important in an advanced society that is not close to the threshold of starvation, because you don't need all that money to live well. So finally, your career in finance, and this will be the last section of this course. Once again, I don't think that you want to necessarily be a primarily finance person, but ultimately understand what I've sought to do in this course is to help you understand finance. Some young people are very idealistic, and they might consider eschewing any connection with finance immediately, right now, as they're young. But my thought on that is, if you want a perfect career morally, do you really stay out of business? You could give away 90% of your income now as a teenager and not take the course of improving your human capital, giving it all away now. But the problem with that is you won't be very contributing to society because your income at this stage isn't very high. So you want instead, I think, to accumulate while you're young and give it away when you're older. This makes sense. Bill Gates is an example with the Gates Foundation, the largest transparently operated charitable foundation. That is, as far as we know, a real charitable foundation and not some religious group or government crony. It recently had an endowment of almost $40 billion. Warren Buffett gave to them as well. Now, both Gates and Buffett have been going around with a giving pledge, saying that anyone who signs the pledge would promise to give away half of their wealth before are old. You don't want to wait until you're 90 to give it away. The whole idea of Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth is that the system rewards with wealth the people who have the talent for affairs. But that talent is limited. As you age, you'll have cognitive decline, you'll have energy decline. So you are morally obligated to use that talent, to give it away constructively. Don't give it to your kids. Don't give it to your spouse. That's the idea. Here's an example of someone who you might have heard of, Muhammad Yunus, who has led an exemplary financial life. He got his PhD in economics at Vanderbilt University in 1969. He took a job as assistant professor of economics at Middle Tennessee State University. But then he had the idea of founding a bank in his home country of Bangladesh. He had an idea for democratizing finance. And the idea was to make small loans to individuals that could be done in such a way that it's profitable. The problem with lending to poor people is that they're more of a nuisance than a, than a source of profit. They want a small amount of money. We're talking about lending a small amount of money to a woman with a poor family that's living on the edge, so that she can buy a little push cart that keeps food warm, and she can go somewhere where people are, where poor people congregate, and sell lunches. But she doesn't have the money to get the push cart and to buy the food to start with. So he found a way of making that work. And for that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, not the Economics Prize, the Peace Prize in 2006. Now, he has lots of critics who question whether it really worked, but apparently it did. The bank grew and prospered. So there's an example of applying finance creatively. So I think that your financial life will be concentrated in the next 5 or 7 decades, I'll say optimistically. This will be a world of financial capitalism. Financial markets will be everywhere. But financial booms and crashes will be even bigger than before. Despite all this talk of the FSB, the Dodd-Frank, etc.
The FSB stands for the Financial Stability Board, which is an international body that monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system.
Curing these problems. They won't get cured because they're endemic. When you have opportunities for people to act and form organizations and finance them, there's going to be excesses. And we shouldn't be too afraid of them. The excesses will be offset by the greater economic growth that happens. So we'll see dramatic changes in finance in coming decades and in our economy, particularly with the growth of information technology. And that will create opportunities and challenges. So let me cap this with just some thoughts. I've said this already, but your outlook is really at least a century. That is, you might live another 100 years, but even if you don't, your children will, or people you care about will. And just think about the upheavals and changes in the last century. Remember this, what you see is all there is fallacy, is probably affecting your thinking, and you're not thinking creatively enough about how things will be really different in 50 years or 100 years. We have an illusion of invulnerability, but things surprise us. This is a quote from the Bible, from Ecclesiastes 9:11. Famous quote about randomness in our lives. And so the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor yet riches to men of understanding, but time and chance happeneth to them all. I gave a talk once at Yeshiva University, which is an Orthodox Jewish university in New York. And there were some Talmudic scholars there. And they questioned it wasn't my translation, the word chance. And one of them there said, in ancient Hebrew, they didn't have a word for chance. They didn't even understand that there could be something like probability affecting our life. Everything was God's will or something like that. But then another scholar stood up and said, oh, it could have been correctly translated as accident. And so then I said, well, what's the difference between chance and accident? Anyway, this is a lively quote. It's still being debated. But to me, it means something, that it is true that our lives are driven by chance. Finance is a theory of risk management, but it's not going to control all the risk. The book Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb. Have you heard that book? I recommend that. I should have maybe put it on the reading list. But it's about life and chance. That we blame ourselves too much for failures. We let our successes go to our heads. It's largely just randomness. So the question is, what do you do Well, first of all, you want to study risk management and finance, but more importantly, you have to think about your human capital, your positioning in history. One of the most important talents I think that some people have over others is that they're thinking about how I fit into historical events right now, rather than thinking about where I am in my own personal life cycle. The world changes, and most people don't really anticipate the changes. I think another really important thing for young people to do is to maintain human capital. That is, keep thinking about how what skills you have will be important and needed by others under maybe different conditions. And finally, maintain humanity in an unforgiving business world. And that's my last slide. All right, so I hope you find purpose in life and in finance. And I think that wraps up this course. Okay, thank you.
Confirmed.